Hello again, this is Helen, and we've been exploring all sorts of new techniques, some of which I've been talking about recently on my Facebook page, Helen M Stevens True Embroideries. And we're going to look now at the technique which we need to create a delicate little spider's web. Those of you who've looked at the other videos will realise that I've actually inverted my design here so that we can work this technique a little bit more easily. A couple of things always to bear in mind when you're stitching. Try to be able to stitch so that you're not wiping your hand across too much of the rest of your embroidery. And also, if you're working on a tambour hoop, keep the screw away from whichever hand you're working with. So we're going to work our little spider's web, just a small one here at the top, although it looks like the bottom of our design. I'm using a very fine silk again, but once again you can use any type of thread for this particular technique. And the first thing that we're going to do is work the framework of the web. And we do that very easily by taking 3 long stitches. First of all, we're going to stitch from A to B, from this point here to that point there. We're going to take a tiny little stitch at the back of the work just to anchor our thread in place, and then we're going to stitch down to point C. Same thing again, a tiny little stitch just to anchor that thread in place, and out again to where we began at point A. And there we have the framework for our spider's web. Now we need to put the spokes of the wheel in. And so we're going to again take just a tiny anchoring stitch up at point A there. And we're going to take a long stitch across the middle of what will be the web to approximately halfway between points B and C. So pop your needle in at that stage, and I'm starting to lose the tail of my thread there, so I'm just pulling it back into place. And we have one long thread. Now we go back to point B, and again we're going to stitch across the web into the middle of the opposite side. And finally, we're going to work from point C, again across to the middle there, taking a little tiny stitch at that point so that we have the spokes of a wheel. Now you might find when you work this the first few times that all your stitches don't quite meet in the middle. And if that is the case, don't worry. Just pop into the centre there, take one stitch just to anchor them all in place. So now we have the framework of our web, the spokes, and a little anchoring stitch to hold everything together. Now we're going to build up the circuits around that central point. So stitch from one side to the other of any of those little spokes, it doesn't really matter where you start. Take a little stitch at the back to anchor it, just as we did at the outside points, and then again over 2. So behind that 1 and then over 2. Behind that 1 and over 2. Now you can work this technique on any size of web you like. It simply means that you need to do more or less circuits of your spokes. There's our first circuit complete, and you really can see the spider's web beginning to come together. You're going to now take another circuit. Now this time work in the opposite direction. So come out on this side, can you see where my needle is? This side of the spoke and go over 2. Little stitch at the back and over 2. Little stitch at the back and over 2. And again, we need to just do this as many times as necessary to build up the shape of that web. Just imagine you're a little spider dotting your way around the circuit of your web. One more stitch, and that could, if we wanted to, be quite enough. Now, as I said, you can work this in various different sizes. On this piece, which we've looked at before, I've done a slightly bigger web. You can make the shape of the outside of the web just whatever you like. Generally speaking, it's easy to use 3 sides, but you can use 5 or 7. It's easier to work an uneven number of the outside of your web. And then, of course, just as many spokes as you need to fill it up. There's a little spider sitting at the top here. I'll be putting up another little video to show you how to work him a little bit. And of course, we can come from a large piece down to a very small, delicate interpretation of the spider's web. Suspended here on a surfaced couched silver thread. You'll find surface couching in another of these videos. I've worked 3 tiny little spider's webs, one here in the very fine silk and 2 in the Krynic blending filament that we've also talked about in other videos. And here I've suspended tiny little seed beads just to look like little dewdrops or little ice flakes suspended in the webs. So there we are, a spider's web. Lots of different interpretations of how we can use it. And join me soon when we'll look at the spider himself.